Remaking Akira Kurosawa is almost a creative death sentence. Not because the original films are untouchable relics, but because Kurosawa understood something that most remakes forget. A great story is never just a sequence of events. It is an entire moral architecture. Change the setting, the characters, the social hierarchy, and even the culture surrounding the story, and suddenly you are not simply remaking a film. You are rebuilding the machine that made it work in the first place. That is why attempting to remake High and Low is such an audacious move. Kurosawa's 1963 masterpiece takes a kidnapping and turns it into a brutal examination of class. A wealthy executive is placed in a horrifying position when a child is abducted because of a mistake. The ransom becomes more than money. It becomes a measurement of how much one human life matters when placed against another person's fortune, comfort, reputation, and future. Spike Lee takes that same moral grenade and throws it directly into modern New York. In Highest to Lowest, the mansion becomes a Dumbo penthouse, the corporate empire becomes the music business, and the wealthy executive becomes David King, a legendary music mogul played by Denzel Washington. He is a man who has spent decades transforming taste into power. He knows which artists matter. He knows which records will survive. He knows how the industry works because, in many ways, he helped build the version of it that exists around him. And then one phone call destroys the illusion that he controls anything. A child has been kidnapped. The ransom is $17.5 million. But there is a devastating mistake. The kidnappers were supposed to take David's son. Instead, they took the son of his chauffeur. That single error transforms a familiar thriller premise into a moral nightmare. David can pay the ransom, but doing so could destroy the financial foundation of his empire. He can refuse, preserve his position, and allow an innocent child from a poorer family to potentially die. Suddenly, the question is no longer simply, how much money would you pay to save a child? It becomes something far more uncomfortable. What is a human life worth when your entire empire is on the line? And that is where Spike Lee's version becomes fascinating. Kurosawa was examining the distance between people separated by class. Lee places that same distance inside the world of Black American wealth, music, celebrity, and cultural ownership. The penthouse and the street are no longer just different physical locations. They represent two completely different experiences of America. David King has reached the top, but the film keeps asking whether reaching the top has made him morally higher. The irony is almost perfect. He has spent his life deciding which artists deserve attention, which sounds deserve money, and which careers deserve to exist. Yet when the kidnapping begins, another man suddenly controls the value of his own life. His art collection cannot help him. His reputation cannot help him. His millions cannot guarantee the outcome. And the person standing on the other side of the equation is not simply a criminal. Young Felon represents a newer economy of fame, one where notoriety itself can become currency. In a world ruled by streams, algorithms, viral moments, and constant visibility, even criminality can become a form of promotion. That creates the central contradiction of highest to lowest. David represents old power. Young Felon represents new attention. One man built an empire by discovering talent. The other understands how to become the spectacle. Between them stands a kidnapped child, forcing both versions of success to reveal what they are actually worth. That is why this remake works as more than a remake. Spike Lee is not simply asking whether Kurosawa's story can survive in New York. He is asking whether the moral crisis of High and Low has become even more relevant in an age where wealth, music, race, influence, and attention are increasingly inseparable. The original asked what separates the high from the low. Lee asks whether the distance between them has ever really disappeared. Section 1.2, Video Roadmap. To understand why Highest to Lowest is such an unusual adaptation, we have to begin by looking backward before we can understand what Spike Lee is doing forward. Kurosawa's High and Low begins in a world that feels almost sealed off from everything outside it. The wealthy live above the city, physically and psychologically separated from the people beneath them. The early sections are controlled, tense, and almost claustrophobic. The characters debate, calculate, and argue while the threat of the kidnapping slowly tightens around them. Spike Lee preserves that basic dramatic architecture, but he eventually breaks it open. The first half of Highest to Lowest is about confinement. David King's penthouse becomes a pressure chamber where money, family, business, and morality collide. Every conversation feels like a negotiation because David has spent his entire life believing that problems can be solved through control. Then the movie descends. The elegant rooms give way to subway platforms, crowded streets, police operations, music venues, and the unpredictable energy of New York City. The film's geography begins reflecting its psychology. What starts as a contained moral dilemma becomes a citywide pursuit. And that transformation is going to be at the heart of this breakdown. We are going to trace the story from David King's risky attempt to regain control of his record label, through the kidnapping that threatens everything he owns, into the ransom operation that sends millions of dollars through New York's subway system, and finally toward the confrontation that forces David to reconsider what kind of man he wants to be. But the plot is only the surface. We are also going to examine David himself, because Denzel Washington's performance gives the movie its emotional center. David is confident without being invincible, wealthy without being completely secure, and intelligent enough to understand the trap while still being emotionally vulnerable to it. Then there is young Felon, whose psychology reveals a completely different relationship with fame. His ambition is not simply financial. He wants recognition. He wants cultural power. He wants to become impossible to ignore. That makes him an unsettling mirror of David. We will also look at Jeffrey Wright's Paul Christopher, whose position exposes the class divide that the movie inherits from Kurosawa. We will examine Pam King's role, the police investigation, and the way every supporting character helps expose another layer of David's moral transformation. From there, we will move into the film's major themes: class inequality, corporate ownership of art, the economics of fame, legacy, aging, and the difference between possessing culture and actually belonging to it. And then there is the filmmaking itself. We will break down Matthew Libatique's cinematography, Spike Lee's use of New York geography, the visual contrast between elevated luxury and street-level chaos, the subway sequences, the movement of the camera, and the ways Lee transforms Kurosawa's visual ideas into something unmistakably his own. Music will be equally important. Because this is a film about the music industry, sound cannot simply decorate the story. The score, source tracks, hip-hop textures, funk, soul, and the natural sounds of New York all become part of the movie's storytelling language. Finally, we will step outside the film and ask the larger question: what does Highest to Lowest mean for modern cinema? Because this is not just a reunion between Spike Lee and Denzel Washington. It is another chapter in a partnership that has already produced some of the defining performances and films of their careers. And that makes this adaptation more than a curiosity. It becomes a conversation between generations of filmmakers, two versions of New York, two eras of Black American culture, and two completely different definitions of power. Section 1.3 Audience Connection. There is something strangely comforting about watching an old story return in a new language. If you grew up watching classic cinema, you already know the feeling. You see a familiar premise, recognize the bones of an old masterpiece, and wonder whether modern filmmaking can still make the same story feel dangerous. But if your cinematic education came through hip-hop videos, crime thrillers, streaming culture, and the constantly shifting mythology of celebrity, Highest to Lowest offers another entry point. You do not need to know Kurosawa before watching Spike Lee's version to understand the central conflict. You only need to understand what it means to have something you built threatened by something you cannot control. That is where the film becomes universal. The Lee and Washington partnership has always carried a particular weight, because these collaborations often place individual identity inside larger American systems. Malcolm X explored history, ideology, identity, and transformation through one of Washington's most celebrated performances. Inside Man used the machinery of the heist thriller to examine greed, power, race, and institutional hypocrisy. Now they return to a story originally built around class. But this time the class conflict lives inside the music business. And that makes the material especially relevant to a generation raised around hip-hop. Music is not simply entertainment in this world. It is identity, status, business, memory, rebellion, and social currency. Artists become brands. Executives become gatekeepers. Streaming numbers become measurements of cultural importance. A song can become a career, a fortune, a controversy, or a weapon. That environment makes Kurosawa's original premise surprisingly adaptable. The structure of High and Low was never dependent on one specific industry. At its core, it was about a powerful person being forced to confront someone whose life exists on the opposite side of the social hierarchy. Spike Lee understands that. So instead of treating Kurosawa's film like a museum piece, he asks what its moral dilemma would look like if the wealthy man at the center controlled music rather than manufacturing. The result connects classic cinema with modern culture without completely abandoning either. For longtime film lovers, the movie becomes a chance to revisit Kurosawa's ideas through another filmmaker's eyes. For younger audiences, it becomes an introduction to the structure and philosophy behind one of cinema's most influential crime dramas. And for anyone interested in the relationship between art and capitalism, the story creates an even more uncomfortable question. What happens when the person who owns the art begins losing ownership of himself? That question follows David King through every stage of the film. It is why the movie matters beyond its plot. Because underneath the kidnapping, the police chase, the music business, the celebrity appearances, and the New York spectacle is an old human fear. Discovering that the things you thought proved your worth can disappear overnight. And when they do, the only thing left is the person you actually are. Part 2. Context Background. Section 2.1 Production Origins. Before Spike Lee could turn High and Low into a story about music, wealth, and modern New York, the material had already traveled a remarkable distance. The story did not begin with Kurosawa. It began with American crime fiction. Ed McBain's novel King's Ransom provided the foundation for the kidnapping narrative, creating a story centered around wealth, power, and an impossible ransom decision. Kurosawa then took that material and transformed it into something much larger. Rather than treating the kidnapping purely as a plot mechanism, he used it to examine Japanese society, and the widening distance between different social classes. That transformation is important because it demonstrates what adaptation can actually mean. Kurosawa did not simply translate an American novel into Japanese cinema. He absorbed it, restructured it, and made it speak about his own culture. Spike Lee's challenge is therefore not simply to remake Kurosawa. It is to repeat the same creative process. Take an existing story. Find the pressure point that still matters. Then rebuild the world around it. In Lee's version, that world is the contemporary music industry. The project arrives with significant creative weight because of the companies behind it, including A24 and Escape Artists. But the most important piece of its identity is the filmmaker at the center. Spike Lee has spent decades making films about New York, race, class, commerce, history, art, masculinity, and American contradictions. This material gives him a story where all of those interests can overlap. And then there is Denzel Washington. Their reunion carries its own history. By this point, Lee and Washington have already established one of the most recognizable director-actor partnerships in modern American cinema. Their previous collaborations demonstrated that Washington could occupy very different kinds of characters while maintaining the screen authority that makes him such a compelling leading man. For highest to lowest, that authority becomes essential. David King cannot simply be a rich man. He has to feel like someone who believes he has earned his place at the top. He needs to possess the confidence of an executive, the taste of an artist, and the pride of a man who has survived enough of the industry to believe he understands its rules. That makes the kidnapping more devastating. The story is not taking an ordinary person and giving him an extraordinary problem. It is taking a person whose entire identity is based on control and showing him a situation where control becomes meaningless. Alan Fox's screenplay provides the framework for that transformation, but Lee's influence is what gives the adaptation its cultural specificity. The original's businessman becomes a music mogul. Corporate assets become artistic assets. Social status is measured not only through money but through cultural influence. The result is a world where David's home is filled with objects that represent achievement, but those same objects gradually begin to look like evidence in a trial against him. Every painting, every record, every expensive possession, every piece of the empire, they all become collateral. And this is where the title begins to carry its own double meaning. High and low are not simply economic categories. They are psychological positions. David is high because he has wealth, but he is also high because he has spent years believing that his judgment places him above the chaos surrounding him. The streets are low because they sit beneath his penthouse, but they are also low because the people living there have been denied the protections his wealth provides. Spike Lee understands that the original story becomes more powerful when the social geography feels real. New York already provides that geography. The city can move from luxury apartments to subway tunnels within minutes. Wealth and poverty can exist within the same few blocks. A celebrity can pass through a neighborhood as a symbol of success, while someone else struggles to survive within the same economic system. That makes New York more than a backdrop. It becomes part of the argument. And with Lee and Washington reunited, the adaptation carries the additional question of legacy. What happens when two artists with decades of cultural history behind them return to a classic story about a powerful man confronting the limits of his own legacy? The answer is a film that is simultaneously an adaptation, a reunion, and a statement about where both artists stand in their careers. Section 2.2. Pre-release landscape. Long before audiences could decide whether Highest to Lowest succeeded as an adaptation, the project had already become an event. The words Spike Lee and Denzel Washington carry enough history on their own. Put them together again, add Akira Kurosawa's High and Low, and suddenly the movie arrives with expectations that few ordinary crime thrillers would have to survive. People were not simply waiting to see a kidnapping movie. They were waiting to see what Spike Lee would do to Kurosawa. That distinction matters. Every remake of a revered classic enters the conversation already carrying a comparison. The original exists before the new version begins, which means the new film has to compete with something that cannot change, cannot age in the same way, and cannot surprise audiences who already know it. Lee's solution was not to hide the connection. He embraced it. The project was presented as a major auteur event, eventually receiving its world premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, where the conversation naturally centered on the relationship between the two films. That is both an opportunity and a trap. Festival audiences tend to approach adaptations with a different kind of attention. They notice structure, visual references, performances, historical context, and directorial choices. A mainstream audience might simply ask whether the thriller works. A Cannes audience is more likely to ask why Lee changed this scene, why he moved the story here, and what the differences reveal about the filmmaker. And Highest to Lowest gives them plenty to discuss. The casting immediately became part of that conversation. Denzel Washington anchors the film with decades of dramatic credibility, while performers from contemporary music culture, including AAP Rocky and Ice Spice, bring an entirely different cultural vocabulary into the same movie. That decision is risky. A musician appearing in a major dramatic film can immediately create skepticism. Is the casting motivated by talent, relevance, marketing value, or all three? But the music industry setting makes the decision difficult to separate from the story itself. If the film is about a culture where musicians can become some of the most influential public figures in America, then putting real music personalities inside that world can make the fictional environment feel more connected to contemporary reality. At the same time, it raises another question. Can an art house adaptation built on Kurosawa's moral seriousness also function as a modern crime thriller with recognizable stars and contemporary celebrity culture? That balancing act becomes central to the movie's identity. A24's marketing strategy benefits from that tension. The film can be sold to cinephiles as a Spike Lee interpretation of Kurosawa. It can be sold to mainstream audiences as a tense kidnapping thriller. It can be sold to fans of Denzel Washington as another major performance. And it can be sold to younger audiences through its connection to hip-hop and contemporary music culture. Few movies have that many different entry points. But having multiple audiences also means having multiple expectations. Some viewers arrive wanting Kurosawa. Others arrive wanting Denzel. Others want Spike Lee. Others want a crime thriller. Others want a movie about the music industry. And the film has to somehow satisfy all of them while remaining itself. That is a dangerous position, because the same ambition that makes Highest to Lowest interesting also creates the possibility of tonal friction. The film wants to be classical and contemporary, controlled and chaotic, prestigious and entertaining, a remake and an independent work. The rest of the story will reveal whether those contradictions strengthen the movie or expose the seams holding it together. Part 3 Story Recap. David King begins the story from a position most people could only dream about. He lives high above New York in a Dumbo penthouse surrounded by luxury, contemporary black art, expensive furniture, and the physical evidence of decades spent mastering the music business. But the important thing about David is not simply that he is rich. It is that he believes his success has been earned through judgment. He has what people in the industry call the best ears in the business. That phrase tells us almost everything about his identity. David does not see himself as a man who merely got lucky. He believes he can hear greatness before everyone else. He can identify the voice that will matter, the artist who will last, and the sound that will become valuable. His authority comes from taste. And now he is preparing to make one of the biggest decisions of his career. David wants to buy back Stack 'n Hits Records. The deal is enormous, risky, and deeply personal. He is willing to place his own financial security on the line because owning the label means controlling the future of the music he believes in. His home becomes collateral. His art becomes collateral. His personal assets become collateral. Everything that symbolizes his success is being converted into financial leverage. That detail quietly establishes the film's central metaphor. David thinks he owns his empire. In reality, his empire owns him. The more he invests in the deal, the less freedom he actually has. Yet David remains confident. He moves through the penthouse like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Conversations revolve around numbers, contracts, artists, and strategy. Even when the pressure rises, he maintains the composure of a man who believes every crisis eventually becomes another negotiation. Then the phone rings. First, the call seems like another interruption. It is not. The voice on the other end tells David that his child has been kidnapped. The demand is immediate. $17.5 million. No negotiation. No delay. No guarantee. David's entire world changes in a single conversation. The money itself is almost secondary at first. What matters is the violation of his sense of control. Someone has entered the one place where his wealth should have protected him. His family. His home. His future. The same man who can make million-dollar decisions about music suddenly cannot guarantee that a child will come home alive. And then comes the detail that makes the situation unbearable. The kidnappers made a mistake. They did not take the person they intended to take. They took someone else. That mistake transforms the ransom from a family crisis into a class crisis. David is no longer being asked to save his own son. He is being asked whether he will spend his fortune to save someone else's. And before he can answer that question, the film makes us understand exactly what David stands to lose. The $17.5 million is not spare change. It is tied directly to the deal that could determine whether his business survives. Paying means destroying the financial foundation of the future he has been planning. Refusing means risking the life of a child who has done nothing wrong. David's empire has suddenly become a moral price tag. And the terrifying question is whether he can look at that number and still see a human being on the other side. Section 3.2. Act 1 Continued Call to Adventure. The revelation that the kidnapped child is Kyle, the chauffeur's son, changes everything. Until this moment, David's wealth has insulated him from the consequences of his decisions. Now his wealth becomes the thing standing between Kyle and survival. The mistake is devastating precisely because it exposes the class hierarchy that the comfortable world of the penthouse allows David to ignore. Kyle is not supposed to be the important child. He is simply the wrong child. And that phrase carries the entire moral weight of the movie. For Paul Christopher, Kyle's father, there is nothing theoretical about the situation. He is not thinking about business deals, investments, or the future of a record label. He is thinking about his son. Paul occupies the position that David has spent his life looking down upon without necessarily realizing it. He works for David. He drives him. He moves through the wealthy man's world without possessing the protections that wealth provides. When the kidnapping occurs, that invisible boundary becomes impossible to ignore. David can afford to lose millions. Paul cannot afford to lose his child. That distinction is what makes the ransom so cruel. The amount may be the same number for both men, but its meaning is completely different. For David, $17.5 million represents an empire. For Paul, Kyle represents everything, and David knows it. That is why his decision becomes agonizing. If he pays, the money intended to secure stacking hits may disappear. The label could slip away. His financial position could collapse. The assets he spent decades collecting could be gone. If he refuses, he is not simply protecting his business. He is allowing another family's child to remain in danger. This is where David's character begins to fracture. He wants to believe that there is a rational solution. But there is no rational solution to an irrational situation. Every option carries guilt. Every decision has a cost. And every minute of hesitation makes the moral calculation worse. Paul's desperation intensifies the pressure because he cannot understand why his son's life should even be part of David's business equation. From Paul's perspective, there should be no equation. A child is a child. But David's world has trained him to think in terms of value. Artists have value. Records have value. Companies have value. Assets have value. Contracts have value. And now, horrifyingly, a human life has been placed inside that same system. That is the point where the kidnapping story becomes something more than a thriller. It becomes an examination of whether capitalism has changed the way people understand human worth. David eventually chooses to pay. But the decision is not portrayed as simple heroism. He is surrendering something enormous. The money will threaten the future he wanted. His business dream is about to collapse. His carefully constructed identity as the man who always knows the right move is disappearing. Yet Kyle's life remains. And that distinction becomes the first major step in David's transformation. He may still be protecting the empire. But for the first time, he has chosen a human being over the empire. The consequences of that decision are about to follow him through every street of New York. Section 3.3. Act 2. A rising action. Once the police become involved, the private moral crisis becomes a public operation. Detectives Earl Bridges and Higgins begin coordinating the ransom drop, transforming David's personal nightmare into a carefully monitored investigation. But David remains at the center of the plan because the kidnappers want him involved. The police can track. They can listen. They can observe. But they cannot replace the one thing the kidnappers actually want: the money. And that money now represents the destruction of David's financial future. The ransom is prepared in Swiss franc notes, packed into an Air Jordan backpack. The image is almost absurd in its simplicity. Millions of dollars in currency are placed inside something associated with everyday street culture. The backpack is ordinary. The amount inside it is not. And that contrast captures the film's larger obsession with the collision between wealth and popular culture. David has spent his career turning music into an industry. Now the industry has been reduced to a backpack. $17.5 million can fit into something carried over one person's shoulder. That is how quickly enormous wealth becomes physical. The operation sends David onto the subway, toward Yankee Stadium on the 4 train. This is where the movie begins to leave the controlled geometry of the penthouse. David is no longer surrounded by private elevators, expensive furniture, and carefully managed space. He is surrounded by New York. The city is moving around him. Passengers are talking. Trains are arriving. Crowds are forming. Police officers are tracking the operation. Every stranger could potentially be part of the threat. Every delay could cost Kyle his life. The subway creates a completely different kind of tension from the first act. Inside the penthouse, David was trapped by conversation. Now he is trapped by movement. The train keeps going whether he is ready or not. The ransom is moving. The police are moving. The kidnappers are moving. Kyle's fate is moving. And David has no control over the direction. That is the deeper transformation of the sequence. The man who began the film standing above New York is now physically moving through the city at street level. The distance between high and low is no longer theoretical. David is inside it. The detectives must coordinate without revealing themselves. The ransom must appear legitimate. David must follow instructions while resisting the instinct to regain control. And all the while, he knows exactly what the money represents. It is the label, the house, the art, the future, the status, the identity, everything he believed he needed. As the train carries him toward the exchange, the movie tightens the contradiction. David is losing his empire in order to preserve a life. But perhaps that is precisely the point. Maybe the empire was never the measure of his worth. Maybe the money only becomes valuable when he is finally willing to give it away. The problem is that David has not yet reached that realization. For now, he is simply trying to survive the consequences of his decision. And the train is carrying him directly toward the moment when there will be no turning back. Section 3.4. Act 2B Midpoint Crisis. The ransom exchange is one of the film's most important transitions because it changes the story's physical scale. Until this point, the kidnapping has largely been about David's decision. Now it becomes a hunt. The drop is engineered around the movement of the train, forcing David and the police operation into a dangerous choreography. The ransom has to move between train cars. Every second matters. The money has to reach the kidnappers. The police have to track without exposing themselves. And David has to trust a plan that is increasingly beyond his control. The tension comes from the fact that David has already accepted the worst financial consequence. He knows the money is gone. What he does not know is whether Kyle will survive. When the exchange finally succeeds and Kyle is recovered alive, there is an immediate emotional release. The child is safe. The central obligation has been fulfilled. But David has paid the price. His business capital is gone. The deal he wanted is effectively destroyed. The empire he was trying to protect has been sacrificed. And yet, for the first time, David is not thinking primarily about what he lost. He is seeing what he saved. That should be the ending. But the film refuses to stop there. Because the kidnapping has left behind a trail. The police now have a target. The investigation shifts toward identifying the person responsible. And that brings the story into the world of young felon, played by AAP Rocky. This is where Highest to Lowest becomes a different movie. The first half asks whether David will pay. The second half asks whether the person who forced him to pay can be found. The controlled penthouse drama gives way to movement, surveillance, crowds, music, and the restless energy of New York. David's personal crisis becomes a citywide pursuit. And young felon represents something David does not fully understand. He belongs to a generation where attention itself can be monetized. The old music industry required gatekeepers. The new one can reward disruption. The old system asked whether you had talent. The new system can ask whether people are watching. That distinction makes young felon more dangerous than a conventional criminal. He is not simply trying to steal money. He wants to become a story. The kidnapping creates attention. The attention creates curiosity. The curiosity creates dreams. And the streams create money. The crime has become content. That is the horrifying logic of the world David helped create. David built a career by recognizing valuable music. Young felon recognizes valuable attention. Both understand markets. They simply operate in different versions of them. As the police close in, the movie's central conflict changes again. David is no longer deciding what he is willing to sacrifice. Now he has to confront the person who made him sacrifice it. And somewhere underneath the anger is another uncomfortable realization. Young felon may be closer to David than David wants to admit. Section 3.5. Act 3 Climax Resolution. The pursuit eventually reaches its violent conclusion through a police raid and confrontation that turns the abstract battle over money and fame into physical danger. The operation erupts into a shootout. The controlled logic of the ransom plan disappears. People are running. Weapons are fired. The police move in. Paul is injured. And young felon is finally captured. For a conventional thriller, this might be the moment when the story declares victory. The criminal is arrested. The child survived. The protagonist has endured the crisis. But highest to lowest has been building toward a more complicated ending. Because young felon's arrest does not destroy his fame. It amplifies it. The world becomes fascinated with him. His notoriety turns into attention, and attention turns into streams. He becomes the most streamed artist in the world. The irony is brutal. David King spent years building an empire through music. Young felon reaches a level of commercial visibility through crime. The system rewards both men for completely different reasons. One represents mastery. The other represents spectacle. And somehow the spectacle wins. That revelation forces David to reconsider what he has been chasing. For decades, he believed ownership was the ultimate form of power. Own the label. Own the music. Own the catalog. Own the company. Own the future. But young felon exposes the weakness of that philosophy. In a culture where attention can be converted into money almost instantly, ownership is no longer the only form of influence. Visibility can be enough. The final prison encounter between David and young felon therefore carries a strange intimacy. The two men stand on opposite sides of the system, but they understand each other. David sees what young felon represents. Young felon sees what David used to represent. One man built power through years of work. The other grabbed power through one explosive act. Yet both understand the hunger behind the music business. The hunger to matter. The hunger to be heard. The hunger to control the narrative. The difference is what each man was willing to sacrifice to satisfy that hunger. David nearly sacrificed his empire. Young felon sacrificed his freedom. And that is the final irony. Young felon wins the commercial war and loses the physical one. He becomes more famous than ever, but he is imprisoned. David loses the business deal he thought defined his future, but gains something much harder to purchase. Perspective. The kidnapping began by asking what a human life was worth. By the end, David has discovered the answer cannot be measured in dollars, streams, ownership percentages, or fame. Kyle is alive. Paul has suffered. David has changed. And young felon has become a celebrity behind bars. The high and the low have collided, but neither side emerges untouched. Part 4. Character Analysis. Section 4.1. Protagonist Deep Dive. David King is compelling because his transformation does not begin with humility. It begins with confidence. He knows he is good at what he does. He knows his reputation is deserved. He knows how to identify talent, negotiate deals, and survive an industry that has spent decades changing around him. That confidence is part of his strength. It is also his weakness. David's external goal is straightforward. By backstacking hits records and regain control over the company and the music he values. But his internal need is much deeper. He needs to rediscover why the music mattered to him before it became an empire. At the beginning, those two motivations are almost indistinguishable. David believes owning the label means protecting the art. But the kidnapping separates those ideas. He is forced to choose between ownership and humanity. And when he gives up the money, something inside him changes. The decision costs him financially, but it also frees him from a version of himself that had become dependent on control. Denzel Washington understands that transformation without overplaying it. His David is rarely frantic in the obvious sense. The performance is built around restraint. He speaks like a man accustomed to being listened to. He carries himself with the confidence of someone whose reputation enters a room before he does. But beneath that composure is fear. Not merely fear of losing money. fear of discovering that the life he built may not mean what he thought it meant. That is where Washington's gravitas becomes essential. He can make David appear powerful without making him emotionally inaccessible. A look can reveal frustration. A pause can reveal doubt. A controlled sentence can hide panic. And when David finally accepts that his business empire has to come second, the moment feels less like a heroic speech and more like an internal surrender. He stops trying to win. That is the paradox. The man who spends the entire film trying to regain control ultimately becomes stronger by accepting that some things cannot be controlled. The climax reinforces this transformation. David's rejection of corporate greed is not simply a business decision. It is a rejection of the idea that ownership automatically creates meaning. Music was never valuable because David possessed it. It was valuable because it moved people. The distinction sounds simple. For David, it takes an entire crisis to understand it. And that is why his character works as a modern reinterpretation of Kurosawa's central figure. The wealthy man begins the story measuring everything through value. He ends it understanding that some things become meaningless the moment you put a price on them. Section 4.2. Antagonist psychology. Young Felon is frightening because his ambition is recognizable. He wants attention. He wants success. He wants respect. He wants to matter. None of those desires are inherently evil. The danger begins with what he is willing to do to achieve them. His resentment comes from understanding that the traditional system was never designed to give him the same opportunities available to someone like David King. David entered the industry, developed his taste, built relationships, accumulated wealth, and eventually became a gatekeeper. Young Felon sees the gate and decides to destroy it. That is the psychology behind his extremity. He does not want permission. He wants impact. And in the modern attention economy, impact can arrive through almost anything. Talent can create attention. Controversy can create attention. Violence can create attention. Scandal can create attention. The algorithm does not necessarily care why people are watching. It cares that they are watching. That makes Young Felon a particularly modern antagonist. He understands that outrage can function as marketing. A crime becomes a headline. A headline becomes a conversation. A conversation becomes curiosity. Curiosity becomes streams. And streams become cultural legitimacy. The system has transformed notoriety into a product. Young Felon simply learns how to exploit it. But what makes him more interesting is the connection to David. David may be horrified by Young Felon's methods, but he recognizes the hunger behind them. There was a younger David who also wanted to prove himself. There was a time when David was not an established executive. There was a time when he had to fight for credibility. The difference is that David eventually learned how to operate inside the system. Young Felon refuses to wait. That makes him a distorted mirror. David mastered the rules. Young Felon weaponizes the collapse of those rules. And the tragedy is that Young Felon actually succeeds. He gets the attention. He gets the streams. He becomes famous. But he cannot enjoy the freedom that fame was supposed to provide. His success becomes a prison. That contradiction is the character's deepest meaning. He wins exactly what he wanted and discovers that wanting it was never enough. Section 4.3. Supporting cast dynamics. Jeffrey Wright's Paul Christopher provides the emotional grounding that keeps the story from becoming entirely about David's transformation. Paul is not fascinated by David's empire. He does not care about the label. He does not care about the art collection. He does not care about corporate ownership. He cares about Kyle. That simplicity makes him powerful. Paul represents the human cost of the class divide in a way that statistics never could. David can discuss millions. Paul can discuss his son. Those are two completely different languages. The film becomes strongest when it allows that difference to exist without trying to explain it away. Paul's position also complicates David's heroism. David pays the ransom, but the money belongs to David. Paul cannot simply decide to sacrifice millions because he does not possess millions to sacrifice. His desperation exposes the privilege hidden inside David's moral decision. For David, generosity is devastating. For Paul, the lack of wealth is devastating every day. Pam King, meanwhile, functions as an important moral counterweight. She understands David's personality well enough to recognize when his confidence is becoming obsession. Her presence prevents David from existing only inside his own worldview. The detectives serve another purpose. Earl Bridges and Higgins transform the story into a procedural and provide an institutional perspective. They are not emotionally invested in David's business empire. Their job is to solve the kidnapping, protect the victim, and catch the people responsible. That difference is valuable. David thinks like an executive. Paul thinks like a father. Pam thinks like someone who knows David personally. The detectives think like investigators. Young Felon thinks like an attention entrepreneur. Each character therefore represents a different definition of value. Money, family, love, duty, fame, justice. The story becomes richer because David has to move between all of those systems. And Paul remains especially important because he reminds us what can disappear when the wealthy man's crisis is treated as the only crisis that matters. The movie may be named around David's position between high and low, but Paul is the character who makes that distinction impossible to ignore. Part 5 Themes Symbolism. Section 5.1 Core Themes. At its heart, Highest to Lowest is a film about class. But it is not simply a story about rich people and poor people. It is about what happens when people living within the same community experience completely different versions of security. David's wealth gives him choices. Paul's lack of wealth removes choices. That difference becomes brutally clear when Kyle is kidnapped. David can debate whether to pay. Paul can only hope that David does. The penthouse therefore becomes more than a luxury setting. It represents insulation. David can look out over New York without necessarily experiencing the reality of the people below him. But the kidnapping collapses that distance. The street enters the penthouse. The poor family's crisis becomes the wealthy family's crisis. And suddenly the invisible economic boundary becomes impossible to ignore. The film also examines corporate exploitation of art. David loves music. That love is genuine. But he has also built a business around it. That contradiction matters. Artists create culture. Executives organize, package, distribute, and monetize that culture. The system can support creativity, while simultaneously reducing creativity to an asset. David's struggle reflects that contradiction. He believes he is protecting music by owning it. But the film gradually asks whether ownership can become another form of control. The same problem appears in modern fame. Attention has become transactional. Outrage creates engagement. Engagement creates visibility. Visibility creates revenue. Young Felon understands that equation perhaps better than anyone. He is willing to become infamous because infamy can be converted into cultural relevance. That creates one of the film's darkest observations. In an economy where attention is the product, morality can become inconvenient. The question is no longer whether something is good. The question becomes whether people are watching. David's journey offers the alternative. Integrity may not maximize profit. It may not produce the largest audience. It may not make someone the most streamed artist in the world. But it can preserve something money cannot replace: a sense of self. Section 5.2 Visual Symbolism. Spike Lee's visual language makes the film's central contradiction physical. The most obvious symbol is verticality. David begins high above New York. His penthouse literally places him above the city. The subway tunnels and streets exist below. This recreates one of Kurosawa's most powerful structural ideas, while giving it a distinctly contemporary New York identity. The higher David is, the more separated he appears. But the kidnapping forces him downward. He enters the subway. He moves through crowded streets. He becomes another body inside the city. The physical descent mirrors his moral descent. At first, David sees the city from above. Eventually, he has to experience it from within. The Air Jordan backpack creates another powerful image. Millions of dollars are placed inside an object associated with ordinary street culture and consumer identity. The contrast is almost deliberately ironic. A luxury empire becomes portable. $17.5 million can be carried by one person. The backpack therefore becomes a symbol of the strange relationship between capitalism and culture. The same consumer objects that sell identity can also become containers for enormous financial power. David's art collection works differently. The artwork represents taste, achievement, cultural knowledge, and status. But as the ransom crisis develops, those paintings also begin to look like possessions that can be sacrificed. The question becomes whether David owns the art, or whether the art is part of the identity he has constructed around himself. This is one of the film's most subtle tensions. A person can surround himself with cultural objects without necessarily understanding the values those objects represent. David knows art. He knows music. He knows business. But the kidnapping forces him to discover whether he knows himself. The film's geography keeps returning to the same question: high, low, inside, outside, private, public, luxury, survival. The spaces do not merely contain the characters. They explain them. Section 5.3. Deeper meanings. David King can easily be read as more than a fictional music executive. He can also be viewed as a portrait of an artist or cultural figure confronting longevity. That is where the character becomes particularly interesting in relation to Spike Lee himself. Lee has spent decades inside an industry that constantly changes around its most established creators. He has witnessed theatrical cinema, home video, cable, digital distribution, streaming, social media, and the transformation of audience behavior. David experiences a similar crisis. He built his identity under one set of rules and now has to survive inside another. The music industry has changed. The film industry has changed. The definition of cultural success has changed. But the hunger to remain relevant has not. That is why young Felon becomes such an effective symbol of the new era. He represents a culture where visibility can matter more than craftsmanship. The algorithm does not necessarily reward the most talented person. It rewards whatever produces attention. That can be liberating because traditional gatekeepers lose some of their power. But it can also be destructive because outrage, controversy, and criminality can become commercially valuable. Young Felon becomes the ultimate example. His arrest should destroy his career. Instead, it makes him bigger. His crime becomes publicity. His publicity becomes music streams. His imprisonment becomes part of his mythology. He loses freedom while gaining commercial relevance. That is the tragic irony. David spent his life trying to own music. Young felon discovers that modern culture may reward the person who simply owns the conversation. The film therefore becomes a meditation on legacy. What survives when the money disappears? What survives when the company changes hands? What survives when the algorithm moves on? David's answer gradually becomes clear. The work matters. The relationships matter. The choices matter. But most importantly, the person behind those choices has to remain recognizable. Otherwise, success becomes another form of disappearance. Part 6 Production Breakdown. Section 6.1 Animation Visual Effects Cinematography. Matthew Libatique's cinematography plays a major role in translating the film's moral architecture into visual space. The first half is dominated by controlled compositions and wide framing that make the penthouse feel simultaneously enormous and suffocating. That contradiction is essential. David has more physical space than most people could imagine, yet he feels increasingly trapped. The wide compositions allow us to see the luxury around him, the paintings, the furniture, the architecture, the windows overlooking New York. But the same images remind us that David is surrounded by possessions that can suddenly become liabilities. The room is beautiful. The situation is unbearable. That is the visual paradox. As the story moves outward, the camera language becomes more kinetic. The subway sequences introduce movement, crowds, confined spaces, and unpredictable visual information. New York begins to overwhelm the carefully controlled world established in the penthouse. This is where Spike Lee's filmmaking instincts become especially visible. His cinema has always been interested in movement, rhythm, performance, and the relationship between individuals and their environments. The famous double dolly technique associated with Lee becomes another expression of psychological instability. When characters appear to move unnaturally through the frame, the world itself seems to shift beneath them. The effect can be playful, unsettling, or both. That tonal flexibility is important because highest to lowest is not interested in maintaining one visual mood. The film begins sterile. It becomes energetic, then chaotic. The color and texture of New York gradually replace the controlled environment of the penthouse. The city feels alive in a way David's luxury home does not. That does not mean the street is safer. It means it is more honest. The penthouse is designed to protect David from unpredictability. New York is built around unpredictability. The camera therefore changes as David changes. Early on, the film observes him. Later, it moves with him. Eventually, it seems to chase him. The visual style mirrors the collapse of control. Section 6.2 Directorial Vision. Spike Lee's greatest challenge is not making high and low modern. It is making the film unmistakably his own without destroying what made Kurosawa's original powerful. He approaches that challenge through contrast. Kurosawa's film is famously controlled. Lee is often interested in collision. Kurosawa builds tension through precision. Lee can build tension through energy. Kurosawa's social critique emerges through structure. Lee often allows social commentary to enter through humor, music performance, and cultural references. The result is not a rejection of the original. It is an argument with it. The film's transition from penthouse drama to street-level procedural demonstrates this philosophy. The first half allows conversations to carry the suspense. The second half allows New York itself to become a participant. Crowds at Yankee Stadium create visual scale. The Puerto Rican Day Parade adds cultural texture and movement. Subway platforms turn public transportation into a maze. The city is never neutral. It has its own rhythm. And Lee has spent his career understanding that rhythm. His New York does not simply provide locations, creates personality. That is why the movie can shift from serious moral drama into moments of humor, without completely breaking itself. Lee has always understood that real cities are not tonally consistent. People laugh during crises. Music plays during tragedy. Strangers continue living their lives while someone else's world is collapsing. That realism allows the movie to blend social commentary with crime thriller conventions. The result is a film that respects the classical structure while refusing to behave like a museum piece. Kurosawa provides the skeleton, Lee adds the pulse, and New York provides the bloodstream. Part 7 Music Sound. Section 7.1 Musical Score Analysis. Howard Drawson's score has a difficult job because the film exists between two musical traditions. On one side is the classical dramatic language associated with the original. On the other is the modern soundscape of New York, hip-hop, funk, soul, and the music industry itself. The score therefore cannot simply tell the audience how to feel. It has to bridge worlds. The dramatic passages carry a sense of classical tension, echoing the seriousness associated with the original film, while remaining compatible with Spike Lee's contemporary setting. That gives the movie a feeling of history. We are watching something new. But the musical language reminds us that the moral problem is old. The subway sequence is where the score becomes especially important. As the ransom moves through the city, the music intensifies. Tempo becomes part of the suspense. The closer David gets to the exchange, the less room there seems to be for hesitation. That musical escalation mirrors the physical movement of the train. The sound feels like it is accelerating toward an unavoidable decision. But the score also has to coexist with the sounds of real New York. That creates a productive dissonance. Orchestral drama can suggest that David's situation is monumental. Subway noise reminds us that, to everyone around him, it is simply another day in the city. That contrast is powerful. David believes the entire universe is focused on his crisis. New York does not stop for him. Trains continue. Crowds continue. Music continues. People continue. The score creates the emotional reality. The environment creates the social reality. The film needs both. Section 7.2 Song Sound Design. The source music gives the second half of the film an entirely different pulse. Funk and soul tracks bring movement and history into scenes that could otherwise feel purely procedural. The music reminds us that David's world is not abstract corporate entertainment. It comes from a cultural tradition with generations of meaning behind it. James Brown needle drops add another layer. Brown's music carries physical energy, confidence, rhythm, and confrontation. That makes it particularly effective inside a film about power. The music can make a scene feel alive before the dialogue explains why. Hip-hop functions differently. When it becomes diegetic, it helps define young Felon's world. His music is not simply background. It is part of his identity. Tells us how he wants to be perceived. That distinction becomes crucial because young Felon understands music as a vehicle for attention. David understands music as craft. Their relationship to sound therefore reflects their relationship to power. The sound design of the subway and streets keeps the film grounded. Trains screech. Announcements echo. Footsteps overlap. Crowds talk. Traffic moves. Music leaks from spaces. The city produces a constant wall of sound. That realism makes the suspense more immediate, because the characters cannot simply hear the threat. They have to locate it inside noise. A quiet room can create suspense through silence. New York creates suspense through excess. Everything is happening at once. That is why the soundscape becomes part of the movie's moral argument. David cannot isolate himself anymore. The world he spent his life looking down upon has become impossible to mute. Part 8. Cultural Impact. Section 8.1. Immediate reception. The combination of Spike Lee, Denzel Washington, Akira Kurosawa, and contemporary music culture guaranteed that Highest to Lowest would become a conversation before audiences even finished watching it. The Cannes premiere intensified that discussion. Some viewers approached the film as a bold reinterpretation. Others naturally measured every change against high and low. That is the unavoidable burden of adaptation. The more beloved the original, the louder the comparison becomes. Casting became another major point of discussion. A.A.P. Rocky's involvement attracted attention because his presence connects the film directly to the music culture it is examining. Ice Spice's appearance created a similar reaction. For some viewers, the casting added authenticity and cultural relevance. For others, it risked making the movie feel too dependent on celebrity recognition. That disagreement is actually appropriate for the film. A story about fame was always going to generate questions about fame itself. The online reaction amplified everything. Scenes could be removed from their original context and transformed into memes, reaction images, short clips, and social media arguments. The rap battle material was particularly suited to that environment because it existed at the intersection of performance and internet culture. A scene designed to serve the narrative could suddenly become a standalone cultural moment. That is precisely the world Young Felon represents. The movie criticizes attention culture while simultaneously participating in it. Every viral clip becomes another example of the system the film is examining. The Cannes discussion also highlighted the most important question surrounding the adaptation. Is Highest to Lowest supposed to compete with Kurosawa or converse with him? The strongest readings argue for the latter. Lee does not need to prove that his version is superior. He needs to demonstrate that the story still has something to say. And the fact that audiences were arguing about that question at all proves how effectively the film reopened the conversation. Section 8.2. Long-term influence. The most valuable long-term effect of Highest to Lowest may be that it sends new viewers backward. A younger audience may encounter Spike Lee's version first. Then curiosity leads to Kurosawa. The remake becomes a doorway into film history. That is one of the most meaningful things a modern adaptation can accomplish. It does not replace the original, creates another path toward it. The film also strengthens the legacy of the Lee-Washington partnership. Their collaborations already occupy an important place in American cinema, but Highest to Lowest demonstrates that their creative relationship can still generate new tension decades into their careers. That matters in an industry obsessed with novelty. Sometimes longevity itself becomes an artistic statement. The movie also contributes to a broader evolution in how Black cinema portrays wealth. Black success has often been represented through individual achievement, struggle, or social mobility. Here, wealth becomes morally complicated. David has made it. He has reached the penthouse. He owns cultural assets. He possesses enormous influence. And yet the film refuses to treat that achievement as the end of the story. It asks what happens after success. Who gets protected? Who gets sacrificed? Who controls culture? Who profits from it? And what happens when the mechanisms of fame begin rewarding the wrong things? Those questions extend beyond music. They apply to film, social media, sports, entertainment, and every industry where attention becomes currency. That is why the film's central conflict can remain relevant even after specific references to the 2020s begin to age. The technology will change. The platforms will change. The slang will change. But the struggle between integrity and exploitation will remain. Part 9. Critical Analysis. Section 9.1. Critics versus Audience. The critical response to Highest to Lowest reflects the movie's greatest strength and one of its biggest weaknesses. Critics who responded positively tended to appreciate the film's swagger. They saw the energy of New York. They appreciated Spike Lee's confidence. They recognized Denzel Washington's command of the material. And they understood the ambition involved in translating Kurosawa's class drama into the modern music industry. An 83 Rotten Tomatoes score reflects a broadly positive critical response, but that number cannot capture the divisions created by the film's tonal structure. Because Highest to Lowest effectively becomes two different movies. The first is a contained moral drama. The second is a kinetic crime thriller. The transition is intentional. But intentional does not automatically mean seamless. Some viewers love the shift. They enjoy watching the film explode outward from the penthouse into the city. Others experience the transition as a loss of focus. They may prefer the psychological intensity of the first act and find the later pursuit less emotionally precise. That divide explains why audiences can react differently from critics. Critics are often more willing to appreciate formal ambition. Mainstream viewers may simply want the story to maintain the emotional contract established at the beginning. If the movie promises one kind of thriller and then becomes another, some viewers will experience that as exciting. Others will experience it as inconsistency. This tension is common in art house adaptations. The filmmaker is balancing respect for the original with the desire to create something contemporary. The audience, meanwhile, is asking whether the new movie works on its own. Highest to Lowest does not always make that answer simple. But perhaps that complexity is part of its value. It is not designed to be consumed passively. It wants viewers to compare, to notice, to question, and to decide whether the differences are flaws or evidence of adaptation actually happening. Section 9.2. Controversies, Criticisms. The biggest criticism of the film is that its ambition sometimes exceeds its control. The early penthouse scenes can feel melodramatic. Characters occasionally speak with the thematic weight of people who know they are inside a movie about morality. That can make the dialogue feel less natural than the visual filmmaking surrounding it. The second major criticism concerns Paul Christopher. Jeffrey Wright gives the character emotional weight, but some viewers may feel that the story gradually moves away from him once the ransom is paid. That creates an uncomfortable contradiction. Paul represents the class conflict at the center of the story. Yet the second half increasingly becomes David's and young felon's story. The wealthy executive and the emerging celebrity become the dominant figures. The working-class father becomes less central. That can make the film feel as though the very class perspective it establishes is being pushed toward the background. There are also thematic subplots that can feel less developed than the main kidnapping narrative. The movie raises questions about corporate ownership, black wealth, streaming culture, fame, legacy, and artistic integrity. Those are enormous subjects. A single thriller cannot explore all of them equally. As a result, some ideas feel deeply integrated while others remain closer to thematic signals. But these weaknesses should be understood in the context of the film's ambition. Spike Lee is attempting to make a crime thriller, a Kurosawa adaptation, a New York movie, a music industry satire, a class drama, a character study, and a late career statement simultaneously. Some friction is inevitable. The real question is whether that friction makes the movie boring. It does not. Even when highest to lowest stumbles, it is rarely timid. Its flaws come from trying too much rather than too little. And that is a much more interesting failure. Part 10. Industry Impact. Section 10.1. Box Office Business. The theatrical performance of highest to lowest demonstrates the difficult economic position occupied by adult-oriented crime dramas in the modern market. A film can have major stars, a legendary director, prestigious source material, and significant cultural relevance, and still struggle to generate a traditional theatrical audience. The reported domestic theatrical earnings of roughly 1.5 million make that reality impossible to ignore. But the number also needs context. The movie exists within a distribution environment where theatrical performance is no longer the only measure of commercial value. Apple TV becomes the larger destination. That changes the business equation. A theatrical release can function as prestige positioning, publicity, and cultural validation rather than simply as the primary revenue engine. A24's involvement adds another layer. The company has built a reputation around filmmaker-driven cinema that can attract audiences through identity and prestige, rather than conventional blockbuster formulas. Highest to lowest fits that ecosystem. It is too adult to be a traditional action franchise, too expensive and recognizable to function like a tiny independent film, too unusual to guarantee mainstream success. That middle ground has become increasingly difficult. Streaming can provide an alternative. Instead of asking whether enough people will purchase a movie ticket, the platform can ask whether the film gives subscribers another reason to remain subscribed. That is a completely different business model. The value of the movie becomes harder to measure through box office alone. And that may be the future of films like this. Section 10.2. Franchise Studio Impact. The relationship between technology companies and auteur filmmakers continues to reshape the economics of prestige cinema. Streaming platforms need distinctive films. Filmmakers need financing. Audiences need reasons to pay attention. A project like Highest to Lowest sits directly at that intersection. Apple gets a high-profile Spike Lee film with Denzel Washington. A24 gets association with major auteur cinema. Lee gets the resources to reinterpret a classic on his own terms. And audiences receive a film that might have been difficult to finance under a purely theatrical model. The larger consequence is that international classics become increasingly available for reinterpretation by filmmakers from different cultural traditions. That can be creatively exciting. It can also be dangerous. A remake can either open a dialogue between cultures or flatten the original into familiar commercial language. Highest to Lowest demonstrates that the best reason to remake a classic is not simply that the title is recognizable. It is that the original contains a problem that another filmmaker still needs to solve. The casting of major recording artists also establishes another precedent. Musicians are no longer limited to cameos or music-driven projects. When placed correctly, their public identities can become part of the storytelling itself. That creates opportunities for authenticity. It also creates risks of distraction. The challenge for future filmmakers will be knowing the difference. Part 11. Legacy. Section 11.1. Historical Significance. Within Spike Lee's filmography, Highest to Lowest belongs to a fascinating late career period, where the filmmaker continues returning to the questions that have defined his work, while placing them inside new genres and new cultural environments. The connection to Do the Right Thing is not about plot. It is about New York. It is about community. It is about the pressure created when social hierarchies become impossible to ignore. The connection to Malcolm X is similarly thematic. That film examined identity, power transformation, and historical legacy through one of Washington's defining performances. Highest to Lowest brings Washington back into a story where identity is once again transformed through crisis. And Inside Man provides another obvious comparison because both films understand crime cinema as a vehicle for examining systems of power. What makes Highest to Lowest particularly significant is its position as an American reinterpretation of a Kurosawa masterpiece. Successful remakes of internationally revered classics are rare because cultural translation can easily become cultural dilution. Here Lee has a clear advantage. He does not need to manufacture New York authenticity. He has spent his career filming the city as a living character. That makes the transformation from Tokyo to New York feel less like relocation and more like reinterpretation. The film also occupies an important space within Black cinema, because it places high finance, music ownership, cultural power, and Black wealth at the center of a major crime narrative. David King is not struggling to enter the system. He owns part of it. That difference matters. The story therefore asks questions about what happens after the dream of success has already been achieved. That is a less common cinematic problem, and it gives the film historical significance beyond its status as a remake. Section 11.2 Timeless versus Dated. Some elements of Highest to Lowest are likely to remain powerful long after the specific cultural references begin to age. Denzel Washington's performance is one. His portrayal of a man whose confidence slowly gives way to moral clarity depends on human behavior rather than technology. That will remain understandable. Kurosawa's central moral dilemma is another. What is a human life worth? Can money justify sacrificing another person? Does wealth create responsibility or merely power? Those questions do not belong to any particular decade. They are permanent. The class divide is similarly durable. The specific references to music platforms, viral culture, and modern celebrity may eventually feel like artifacts of the 2020s. Algorithms change. Platforms disappear. Trends become embarrassing. The slang of one era becomes incomprehensible to another. That is inevitable. But the underlying question remains. What happens when fame becomes easier to manufacture than meaning? That question may actually become more relevant with time. The film's long-term rewatch value will therefore depend less on whether every contemporary reference remains fresh and more on whether viewers continue recognizing themselves in David's dilemma. The best crime thrillers age because their plots become historical, while their psychology remains contemporary. Highest to Lowest has that possibility. Its surface belongs to the present. Its moral conflict belongs to everyone. Part 12. Final Reflection. Section 12.1. Personal Verdict. Highest to Lowest is not a perfect remake. It is not even a perfectly controlled film. There are moments where the dialogue feels heavier than the characters. There are transitions where the movie's tonal shifts can feel abrupt. Some supporting material deserves more attention. And the second half occasionally sacrifices the intimate class drama of the opening for the energy of the chase. But none of that changes the most important fact. Spike Lee had the courage to attempt it. Remaking High and Low was always going to be dangerous. Doing it through the modern music industry makes the danger even greater. Yet Lee does not approach the material like someone trying to recreate a museum masterpiece. He approaches it like a filmmaker asking what the story means now. That is why the film feels vibrant. Denzel Washington gives it gravitas. New York gives it rhythm. Kurosawa gives it architecture. And Spike Lee gives it an identity of its own. The result is flawed, energetic, ambitious, occasionally messy, and frequently fascinating. It is not a replacement for High and Low. It does not need to be. It is a remix. And a remix can succeed without reproducing the original note for note. What matters is whether the new version finds something worth saying. Highest to Lowest does. For fans of Spike Lee, Denzel Washington, crime cinema, music culture, and classic filmmaking, it deserves attention precisely because it refuses to stay inside one category. It wants to be too many things. Sometimes that hurts it. Sometimes that is exactly what makes it alive. Section 12.2. Deeper takeaway. The deepest idea and highest to lowest is not about kidnapping. It is not even about money. It is about the moment when a successful person realizes that the system he spent his entire life mastering has begun to own him. David King believes power means having options. But the kidnapping reveals that options are meaningless if every choice destroys something you value. He can protect his empire. He can save a child. He cannot have both without sacrifice. And that is where the film's larger message becomes painfully relevant. We live in a culture that constantly encourages accumulation. More money, more followers, more streams, more ownership, more recognition, more influence. But accumulation has a hidden cost. The more things become part of your identity, the harder it becomes to walk away from them. David's real transformation begins when he discovers that walking away can sometimes be a greater expression of power than holding on. That is the difference between ownership and integrity. Ownership asks, what can I keep? Integrity asks, what can I refuse to become? Young Felon provides the opposite answer. He gets attention at any cost. He wins the commercial battle. His streams explode. His name becomes bigger. But his freedom disappears. David loses the thing he thought he needed most and gains something he never realized he was missing. Perspective. That is why the final meaning of highest to lowest reaches beyond music. It is about every person who has ever confused success with identity. Every artist who has wondered whether popularity is worth compromise. Every executive who has sacrificed principle for growth. Every person who has looked at the life they built and quietly wondered whether they still belong inside it. The film's answer is not that money is evil. It is that money becomes dangerous when it becomes the measurement of human value. And perhaps that is the reason this story survived from Ed McBain to Kurosawa and now to Spike Lee. The world changes. The industries change. The technology changes. But the question remains. When everything you built is placed on one side of the scale, and another human life is placed on the other, what are you willing to lose? David King finally learns that the answer cannot always be measured in dollars.